Hello everyone. So I've been building this platformer game from scratch, meaning I'm not using any sort of game engine whatsoever. And I've previously created a physics engine that I'm using as a base for the game, except for I'm still missing one major component before I can start actually building out gameplay. And that is, of course, I need a way to add art and animations to the game. Before I actually had the opportunity to work on any new logic, I had a lot of housekeeping to do because I was a little bit lazy when I first started. The main issue that's going to cause immediate problems for me is that all of my game objects are coming from the same class. So I made new classes for my different types of game objects, and they all still extend the original game object class, except for this way it's going to make it way easier for me to differentiate between different types of objects and give them different functionalities, including their own unique art and animations. So now that I'm actually able to start working on implementation for some art, I need a couple things first. First of all, I need some art to implement. So naturally, I went and drew some placeholders in Photoshop with my mouse. And then second of all, I'm going to actually need to decide what my structure is going to look like for my animations. I decided to go about it by splitting the work into a frame class, an animation class, and an animator class. And this way I can store the actual image in the frame class, a list of images in the animation class, and then a list of animations in the animator class. This way I can just slap an animator onto all of my game objects, and then I can load the proper animations, which I'll get to how I'm doing that in a second. The animation class comes with methods for adding or removing frames, but more importantly, it also comes with a method for getting the next frame, which if it's an animation that's played sequentially in order, we'll just pick the next frame sequentially in the list of frames. And if it's played in a random order, it picks a random frame from the list. Pretty simple. There's also a method for starting an animation, but it's not nearly as cool because it just always picks the first frame. Now, since I'm attaching an animator to all of my game objects, when I'm in my main game loop trying to paint the scene and I'm iterating through all those objects, this allows me to access the animator and get the active frame and paint that instead of painting just some random shape. Anyway, back to the animator. It comes with all of the basic methods for adding an animation, removing an animation, retrieving the active animation or frame, but it also has some more interesting methods, which would be the set animation and the update frame. The set animation method just lets me change whatever the current animation is, and then that new animation, I just use the start animation method from the animation class. Update frame method is actually called by every game object on every frame, and this is where I figure out when I need to change my image based on that frame rate that I set in the animation. So the entire game is running on 60 frames per second, and most of my animations I'm running on 15 frames per second. So I just take 60 divided by 15 and I get every 4 frames I should be changing the image. To calculate this, I use a timer where I set it to 0 and I start an animation, and every time this update is called, I increment by 1, and then when it hits 4, I get the new frame and I set that to the active frame. Pretty cool, I'd say. Alright, last thing. So to actually load all these animations into the animators, I used another helper class called the animation loader. And in the animation loader, I actually hard-coded every animation. You need to leave! And I split them into methods based on the objects. I only have 3 objects right now, so I have 3 methods. So every time I create an animator, I just also create an instance of this animation loader, and then I call whatever the correct method is to create that list of animations. With that, I can add all my animations to my game, and obviously it works first try, and I never run into any issues. That's not true, but I'm not going to bore you with the mundane bugs. I will, however, bore you with some major mechanical functionalities that I was forced to implement based on some of these bugs. First issue is really easy to solve. Since my player is no longer symmetrical when I change directions, I actually need to be able to face left or right. So all I have to do is keep track of a Boolean in my player, or actually in all of my objects, except for the player is the only one that will ever face left right now. And then when I am moving left, I just set the facing right value to false. And then when I go and paint it, I paint it the other way. The more pressing issue was actually a bug that I discovered with my collision detection system, where since I'm calculating the entire distance the player could move on every frame instead of stopping at a collision, it's possible for the player to clip through an object and collide with another object which should be hidden. And this was really messing up my movement. To eliminate this issue, I calculate how far the player can move on the x-axis before it runs into a collision, and then I calculate how far the player can move on the y-axis before it runs into a collision. Then based on those max travel distances, I see if the player could actually make those collisions. I know when I explain it like that, it really doesn't sound that complicated, but trust me, I was wrestling with this for an embarrassing amount of time. Anyway, I'm already bored with my placeholder art, so I went ahead and made some more permanent versions. I went back to the old faithful Aseprite. I don't know. I like Aseprite better, but I don't know how I'm actually supposed to say it. Regardless, I'm using pixel art because there's going to be a lot of art to get done for this game, and pixel art is a lot quicker and a lot easier to make it look nice for me. So here's all that new art, and I also added a sprint mechanic and a double jump mechanic and an actual death mechanic, except for all it does is restart the game loop. But I'll talk about all of that at a later date. So I'd say now at this point, I have all of the building blocks in place to actually start focusing on some gameplay mechanics. So make sure to stay tuned for updates on that in the future. And until then, I'll see you next time.